Maradona pushed through the unmarked door on Via Tribunali and planted himself at a corner table, while every fork in the room froze mid-air, and a broad-shouldered owner stepped forward with both palms pressing against the Argentine's chest. Maradona didn't flinch. He grabbed the man's wrist, pulled him into a seat beside him, and called out for 2 plates of whatever was cooking. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become Naples' legend, a story whispered about for decades. Maradona shoved the door open with both hands and walked straight into a wall of silence. Every head in that restaurant turned, every fork stopped mid-air, and a thick-necked man in a black apron stepped directly into his path, palm up, blocking the way forward. This wasn't some movie scene. This was Naples, 1987, and Diego Armando Maradona, the most famous footballer on the planet, had just crossed a line that nobody in this neighborhood crossed. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become Neapolitan legend, a story whispered about for decades in barbershops and backstreets from Spaccanapoli to Secondigliano, a story most people never heard. Until now. Let me set the scene, but I'll do it fast because this thing moves. Naples in the late 80s was a city split in half. The north of Italy looked down on it. Milan, Turin, Rome. They treated Naples the way a landlord treats a tenant who's 3 months behind on rent. And inside Naples itself, there were fractures most outsiders never saw. Neighborhoods carved up not just by the Camorra, the local mafia, but by old codes, old bloodlines, old rules about who belonged where. Maradona had arrived 2 years earlier in 1984, bought by SSC Napoli for a world record fee. He was Argentine, he was short. He had a mop of curly black hair and legs that could do things with a football that made grown men weep. But here's what nobody tells you. Maradona didn't just play for Naples. He became Naples. The poor south of Italy finally had a god, and that god wore the number 10 shirt and lived in their streets, ate in their restaurants, danced in their piazzas, dated their women. He wasn't a tourist. He moved in. And because he moved in, he saw things that the cameras never showed. He saw how the city treated its own. Naples had a significant population of African immigrants in the 80s. Senegalese, Nigerian, Ghanaian. Men and women who had come looking for work, looking for life, and found themselves shoved into the margins. They sold goods on blankets near the port. They worked construction under the table. And in certain neighborhoods, they built their own small world because the larger world didn't want them. There were a handful of gathering spots. Cafes, social clubs, a couple of restaurants, where the African community congregated, where they cooked their own food and spoke their own languages and didn't have to deal with the stares. These weren't black only by any law. Italy didn't have Jim Crow statutes. But they were black only by practice, by invisible walls that everybody understood. Italians didn't go there. And when an Italian did wander in, the reception was cold enough to freeze wine. Believe me, this mattered. Maradona heard about one of these places from a teammate. The story goes that Salvatore Bagni, a midfielder who'd played alongside Diego and who had connections in every corner of the city, mentioned a restaurant near the Port District, run by a Senegalese family. The food was incredible, Bagni said. Thiboudien, a fish and rice dish that would ruin every other meal you'd eat for a month. But Bagni also said something else, something he said almost as an afterthought. He said, "Don't go there, Diego. They don't want us there. It's their place." Now, if you knew anything about Maradona, telling him not to do something was the single fastest way to guarantee he would do it. 2 nights later, Diego grabbed his jacket. He told his driver, a Neapolitan named Giorgio, who had been assigned to him by the club, to take him to the Port District. Giorgio raised an eyebrow. Diego didn't explain. He gave the address and sat in the back seat, bouncing his knee the way he always did before something big, that restless energy that never left his body whether he was on a pitch or off it. They pulled up to a narrow street. The restaurant didn't have a sign out front, just a green painted door and the smell of cumin and smoked fish drifting out of a cracked window. Giorgio parked and looked at Maradona through the rearview mirror. "Boss, are you sure?" Maradona was already out of the car. He walked to that green door, grabbed the handle, and pushed it open. That's where we started. That wall of silence. That thick-necked man stepping into his path. The man's name, and I had to dig for this, was Osmain. He was the owner's brother-in-law, built like a defensive midfielder himself, maybe 6'2", with hands that looked like they'd spent 30 years hauling fishing nets before he ever set foot in Italy. He didn't know who Maradona was. I swear this happened. In a city where Diego's face was spray-painted on the side of buildings, where old women lit candles next to his photograph, Ousmane didn't follow football, didn't care about it. He saw a short, stocky, Italian-looking man pushing into a place where Italian-looking men didn't come unless they were looking for trouble. "We're closed," Ousmane said. In Italian, but heavily accented, and with a tone that made the actual words irrelevant. The message was, "Leave." Maradona looked up at him. Diego was 5'5" on a generous day. Ousmane had almost a full foot on him, but Maradona had spent his entire life being the smallest person in the room and making that room bend to him. "It smells good in here," Maradona said. "I want to eat." "We're closed," Ousmane repeated. Behind Ousmane, the restaurant was clearly not closed. 15, maybe 20 people sat at mismatched tables. Plates of food steamed under bare bulbs. A woman behind a counter at the back was ladling something from a massive pot. Children sat on the floor in the corner playing with bottle caps. This was a community space, not just a business, and Maradona had just walked into the middle of it uninvited. Get this, Diego didn't argue with Ousmane. He didn't pull rank. He didn't say, "Do you know who I am?" That wasn't his style, at least not in moments that mattered. Instead, he did something that caught Ousmane off guard. He sidestepped him, not aggressively, not with a shove. He moved the way he moved on the pitch, a drop of the shoulder, a shift of weight, and suddenly he was past the bigger man and walking toward an empty chair at a table near the wall. Ousmane turned, jaw tight, eyes hard. The room shifted. Two men at a nearby table pushed their chairs back, not standing yet, but ready. A woman near the counter said something sharp in Wolof. The children stopped playing. Maradona sat down. He pulled the chair in, placed his hands flat on the table, and looked around with those dark brown eyes that always seemed to be seeing more than everyone else. He nodded at the man across from him, a wiry Senegalese guy in a blue work shirt who was frozen with a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. "What are you eating?" Maradona asked him. Casual, like they were old friends. The man didn't answer. He looked at Ousmane. Ousmane was already moving toward the table, and his body language had shifted from doorman to something more dangerous. "You need to leave," Ousmane said, and this time he put a hand on the back of Maradona's chair. "Here's where it gets good." Maradona reached into his jacket. Ousmane tensed. Half the room tensed. In a neighborhood where the Camorra operated freely, a hand reaching inside a jacket carried a specific and terrifying implication. But Maradona didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a football, a small, soft, half-deflated training ball that he carried around with him everywhere, his security blanket, his rosary. The thing his hands went to the way a smoker's hands go to a cigarette. He set it on the table. Then he began to bounce it, just with his fingers, tapping it lightly off the wood surface. Rhythmic, almost musical. Tap, 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 tap. The wiry man in the blue shirt stared at the ball. His eyes moved from the ball to Maradona's face, and something changed in his expression. Recognition, not of Diego's face necessarily, but of what that ball meant, of the way those fingers touched it, of the fact that in Naples, in 1987, there was exactly one person on earth who would carry a football into a restaurant and handle it with that kind of casual intimacy. "Maradona?" the man whispered. Diego winked at him. The word rippled outward. You could track it across the room, table by table, face by face. Maradona. The name passed in Wolof, in French, in Italian, in a dozen inflections. Ousmane's hand was still on the back of the chair, but his grip had loosened. His head tilted. He looked at Diego's face again, really looked, and even though he didn't follow football, the name had penetrated even his world. You couldn't live in Naples and not know that name. It was the city's heartbeat. "You're Maradona," Ousmane said. Not a question anymore. "I'm hungry," Diego said. "And I heard the thie boudin here is the best in Naples." Nobody moved for a beat. Then the woman behind the counter, her name was Aminata, and she ran this restaurant with the kind of iron authority that would have made most Camorra bosses nervous, stepped out from behind her station. She was tall, straight-backed, wearing a bright yellow head wrap, and she walked toward Maradona's table with the deliberate pace of someone who was not impressed by celebrity and wanted that understood. She stopped in front of him, looked down. Maradona looked up. "Trust me on this." The tension hadn't broken yet. It had shifted, but it hadn't broken. Knowing who he was didn't automatically mean he was welcome. These people had built this space because the world outside it had rejected them. A famous footballer showing up didn't erase that. If anything, it could make it worse. Celebrities attracted attention, and attention was exactly what this community didn't need. Aminata spoke in French-accented Italian. "Why are you here?" Maradona leaned back. "Because I know what it's like to not be wanted somewhere." The room heard it, and the room understood it. Because Maradona wasn't just a footballer who played in Naples. He was the Argentine who the entire north of Italy mocked. Every away game, the banners came out. "Welcome to Italy," they'd write when Napoli traveled to Verona or Milan, implying Naples wasn't really part of the country. "Wash yourselves, you Neapolitan dogs." The racism aimed at southern Italians was vicious, and Maradona, with his brown skin and his third world origin, caught it double. He wasn't performing empathy. He was speaking from a place that intersected with their own experience in ways no other Italian celebrity could have claimed. Now here comes the turn. Aminata studied his face for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to Ousmane and said something in Wolof. Ousmane's shoulders dropped. He released the chair. And Aminata looked back at Diego and said, "You'll eat what I serve you. That's all I'm asking," Maradona said. She brought him a plate of thigh boudin. And when I say a plate, I mean a platter. Fish, rice, vegetables in a tomato sauce that had been simmering since dawn. She set it in front of him with the unsmiling efficiency of someone who knew her food needed no introduction. Then she set down a second plate and a third at the empty chairs around his table, and she said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "If he eats, everybody eats. Bring your plates." This is real. What happened next took Aminata's restaurant from a private community gathering into something else entirely. People began to move. The wiry man in the blue shirt pulled his chair closer. A couple from another table picked up their plates and came over. Ousmane, the man who had physically blocked the door, walked to the counter, got himself a fresh plate, and sat down across from Maradona. Within 5 minutes, the tables had been pushed together into one long surface, and 20 people were eating alongside Diego Armando Maradona in a restaurant that 30 minutes earlier would have frozen him out. And Diego ate. Man, did he eat. He ate with his hands, which was the proper way to eat thiboudien, and which Aminata noticed and approved of with a single nod. He tore bread, he poured sauce, he talked with his mouth full, which drove Aminata crazy, and she told him so, and he laughed so hard that rice came out of his nose, which made a little girl at the end of the table shriek with delight. But here's what nobody tells you about that night. The eating was just the beginning. After the plates were cleared, Maradona pulled out that little ball again. He stood up from the table, pushed his chair back, and started juggling the ball in the narrow aisle between tables. Keep it up with his right foot, his left foot, his knee, his head, his shoulder. In a space barely 4 feet wide, he kept that ball alive with the precision of a surgeon and the joy of a kid in a backyard. The children on the floor went absolutely wild. They crowded around him, reaching for the ball, and he let them. He tossed it to a boy who couldn't have been older than 6, showed him how to balance it on his foot, steadied the boy's ankle with his hand when it wobbled. One of the men produced a radio, turned it on. Senegalese and Balak's music filled the room, all percussion and call-and-response vocals. Maradona didn't miss a beat. He started dancing with the ball at his feet, incorporating the juggling into the rhythm, and the room lost its mind. Ousmane, the mountain who had blocked the door, was clapping. Aminata was leaning against her counter, arms folded, and for the first time all night, the corner of her mouth turned upward. This wasn't a PR stunt. There were no cameras, no journalists, no entourage of agents and sponsors. Diego's driver Giorgio was sitting in the car outside, listening to the radio, completely unaware of what was happening inside. This was Maradona in his purest form. The kid from Villa Fiorito, the Buenos Aires slum, where he grew up without running water, where the pitch was a garbage-strewn lot and the goalposts were made of stacked bricks. That kid understood something about being an outsider that no amount of fame could overwrite. Mark this moment. This is the turn. Around 10 at night, there was a knock on the door. hard, official. Osmain's face changed instantly. The music stopped. Aminata straightened up. A couple of the men looked at each other with the kind of quick, calculating glance that comes from long practice with unwanted visitors. Osmain went to the door and opened it. Two men stood outside, not police, worse. Local Camorra, low-level enforcers in leather jackets, the kind of guys who collected protection money from every business in the port district. They had a routine. They'd show up, make their presence known, remind the immigrants that their right to operate in this neighborhood came with a price. And if the price wasn't paid, things got broken. People got broken. The first enforcer stepped inside. He was maybe 30, lean, with a thin scar running along his jawline. He scanned the room with the bored authority of someone who'd done this 100 times. "Monthly visit, Aminata," he said. "You know how it works." Aminata's posture went rigid. Her hands pressed flat against the counter. This was the tax. This was the reality these people lived with every day. Pay the Camorra or lose your restaurant, your safety, your place in the city. And nobody in Naples challenged that system. The second enforcer was still at the door when he noticed the short guy standing in the middle of the room with a ball at his feet and a child tugging on his shirt. He squinted, looked harder, then his mouth fell open. "Ciro," he said to his partner. "Ciro, look." Ciro, the scarred one, turned. And for the second time that night, the most famous face in Naples worked its magic. But this time, the stakes were infinitely higher. Ciro froze. His rehearsed swagger vanished. In its place was something Maradona had seen 1,000 times, the involuntary awe that people couldn't fake. Ciro was a Camorra soldier. He had hurt people, threatened people, operated outside the law his entire adult life. But he was also a Neapolitan, which meant that football wasn't a sport to him. It was religion. And Maradona wasn't a player. He was the Messiah. "Diego?" Ciro breathed. Maradona put his foot on the ball, looked at both enforcers. And this is where his genius went beyond the pitch, because what he did next was a piece of tactical brilliance that no coach ever drew up on a chalkboard. He walked toward Ciro, not away, toward him. He extended his hand, the left hand, the hand of God hand, the most famous hand in sport, and he clasped Ciro's palm and pulled him into a half embrace. "Sit down," Maradona said. "Eat with us." Ciro was off balance. This wasn't in his playbook. He was supposed to collect money, issue threats, leave. Instead, Diego Armando Maradona was pulling him toward the long table where 20 African immigrants had been eating and laughing and dancing 5 minutes ago. "Diego, we're here on business," Ciro managed. "What business?" Maradona said. He didn't let go of Ciro's hand. "I see a restaurant. I see good people. I see food. What other business is there?" Here's what Ciro couldn't say out loud. "I'm here to extort these people." He couldn't say it because Maradona's presence had rewritten the rules of the room. You don't extort people in front of a god. You don't show your ugliest face in front of the person who represents the best version of your city. It would be a desecration. Ciro's jaw worked. He glanced at his partner by the door, who gave him a barely perceptible shrug, the universal gesture for "I have no idea what to do." He looked at Aminata, who was watching him with eyes that held no fear for the first time in years. And he looked at Maradona, who was still holding his hand, smiling with those dark eyes, daring him to be something other than what the streets had made him. "Sit down," Maradona said again. Softer this time. Ciro sat down. Aminata brought 2 more plates. The Camorra enforcers ate thiboudien with Senegalese immigrants in a Port District restaurant because Diego Maradona told them to. And if you think that's the end of the story, you're not paying attention, because what Maradona did after the meal was what made this night permanent. He waited until Ciro had finished eating. The food had done its work, not just filling bellies, but softening the geometry of the room. The enforcers and the immigrants weren't friends, but they had shared a table. And that act, however forced, however awkward, had blurred a line that was usually drawn in concrete. Then Maradona stood up. He looked at Ciro, and he said, and multiple people in that room recalled this afterward, independently, in nearly identical words. He said, "This place is under my protection now." 7 words. No explanation, no negotiation, no raised voice. Ciro stared at him, and in that stare was a calculation that went far beyond this room. Maradona wasn't Camorra. He had no soldiers, no territory, no guns. But he had something the Camorra needed more than money. He had the love of the entire city. If Diego Maradona said publicly that someone had been threatening his friends, the blowback would be catastrophic. Not from police, not from prosecutors, from the people. The Neapolitan street, the vox populi, the tidal wave of loyalty that surrounded Maradona and could be directed at anyone who crossed him. The Camorra understood power, and this was a form of it that their guns couldn't touch. "Listen to me," Ciro nodded. He stood up from the table, adjusted his jacket, and looked at Aminata. "Enjoy your evening," he said. Flat, neutral, a withdrawal disguised as a courtesy. He walked to the door, collected his partner, and they disappeared into the Naples night. The room exhaled. Osmani put his hands on the table and pressed down hard, steadying himself. Aminata looked at the door, then at Maradona, and something crossed her face that she clearly didn't want to show. A crack in the armor, a flash of something between gratitude and disbelief, and the overwhelming exhaustion of a person who had been fighting for every inch of ground for years and had just been handed a reprieve by the last person she'd expected. She walked over to Maradona. She put her hand on top of his head, a maternal gesture, a blessing, a claim, and she said, "You eat here whenever you want, free, always." Maradona shook his head. "I pay. Everyone pays. That's how a business survives." I want you to hear that. A man who grew up in poverty, who had every reason to take a freebie, insisted on paying because he understood something fundamental about dignity. Charity can be its own form of condescension. He didn't want Aminata to owe him. He wanted her to operate as an equal. He pulled out cash, way too much cash. Aminata tried to refuse the excess. Maradona put it on the counter, kissed her on the cheek, and walked toward the door. Osmane stood there, same spot where he'd first blocked the entrance, but his posture was different now. He was standing aside, clearing the way. As Maradona passed him, Osmane placed a hand on Diego's shoulder, didn't say anything, didn't need to. Maradona stepped out into the street. Giorgio was leaning against the car, smoking. He looked at Diego, and his eyebrows went up. Something about his boss's face was different, looser, younger. "Good food?" Giorgio asked. "Best in Naples," Maradona said. And he got in the car and disappeared. But the story didn't end at the car door. Not even close. Maradona went back to that restaurant. Not once, not twice. Regularly. Over the following months, he showed up on random evenings, always without warning, always without an entourage. Word spread. Other Napoli players started coming. Bagni, Careca, Ferrara. They came because Diego told them to, and when Diego told you to do something, you did it. But something else happened too. Regular Neapolitans started coming. Not many at first. A curious neighbor, a dock worker who heard the music through the walls, a couple who'd smelled the food walking past. Aminata's restaurant began to transform from an insular community space into something genuinely mixed. African and Italian, immigrant and native, sitting at the same pushed-together tables, eating the same food. The Camorra never came back for collection, not while Maradona played for Napoli. That invisible shield held. And Aminata's restaurant survived, grew, and became a small landmark in the Port District. People called it La Casa di Diego, even though it had an actual name that nobody used. A place where Maradona had walked in uninvited and refused to leave, and in doing so had carved out a tiny pocket of Naples where the rules were different. Now, if this story is hitting you the way it should, and if you want to hear more stories about moments that history books skip over, take 2 seconds and subscribe to this channel. That's all. 2 seconds. I'll be here when you get back. Here's the thing people get wrong about Maradona. They reduce him to football and cocaine. They talk about the genius and the destruction, the goals and the scandals, and they frame his life as a rise and fall narrative because that's the shape that sells. But stories are not that clean, and neither was Diego. He was chaotic, flawed, addicted, unfaithful, and occasionally cruel. He was also, in moments that cameras never captured, one of the most instinctively compassionate human beings who ever lived, not compassionate in the organized, tax-deductible foundation gala sense. Compassionate the way that only someone who has truly suffered can be. Reactive, personal, immediate. He saw Aminata's restaurant, and he didn't see a cause. He didn't see content. He didn't see an opportunity to burnish his brand. He saw people who had been pushed to the margins by a world that considered them disposable, and he recognized himself in them. The kid from Villa Fiorito, where the sewage ran in open ditches and the government pretended you didn't exist. That kid never fully left Diego's body. He carried Villa Fiorito inside him the way some people carry a scar, hidden most of the time but always tender to the touch. When Maradona died in November 2020, the tributes came from everywhere. Kings, presidents, pop stars, athletes. But in the port district of Naples, near where a green-painted door once opened onto a Senegalese restaurant, someone hung a small banner. Handwritten. In French and Italian, it read, "He sat at our table." That's it. No surname necessary, no titles, no statistics. Just the acknowledgement that the greatest footballer who ever lived walked into a room where he wasn't wanted, sat down, ate the food, danced with the children, stared down the wolves, and made a space safe simply by refusing to leave it. Years later, a journalist tracked down Ousmane, who had returned to Senegal. Ousmane was older, grayer, still built like a wall but softer around the edges. The journalist asked him what he remembered about that night. Ousmane was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have stood in the way of many men. He was the only one who made me want to step aside, not because of who he was, because of how he sat down. He sat down the way a man sits in his own home." Aminata passed away in 2014. Her daughter took over the restaurant. It still operates, different location now, but the same food, the same open-door policy, the same push-together tables. On the wall, there's a framed photograph. Not a professional shot, just a Polaroid, faded and slightly blurred. In it, Maradona is sitting at a table with a plate of boudin, his mouth full, his eyes crinkled, a small boy on his lap trying to grab the training ball. Around them, blurred figures eat and talk and lean into each other's space. The image is imperfect. The framing is off. The lighting is terrible. It's the most beautiful photograph in Naples. Maradona walked into that restaurant a stranger. He left it a family member. And in between, he did what he always did, what he did better than anyone who ever lived on or off a football pitch. He took a space that had been defined by its walls and he kicked those walls down, not with speeches, not with money, not with power in any traditional sense, with the simple, stubborn, infuriating act of sitting down where he wasn't supposed to sit and refusing to move. That's not football. That's not sport. That's not even courage exactly. It's something harder to name, something that comes from a place deeper than bravery. It's the bone-deep knowledge that the table belongs to everyone, and that the only way to prove it is to pull up a chair. Diego Maradona. Number 10, 5'5", the boy from the slum who shook the world. He could dribble past 6 defenders. He could score with his hand and call it God's. He could destroy his own body with every substance available and still make you cry with a single touch of the ball. But on one night in 1987, in a Senegalese restaurant in the port district of Naples, he did the most Maradona thing he ever did. He sat down and ate.